make sure that she could see the video and hear it. So.
Okay. I think I'm all set.
You got your little clicker?
Yep.
Turn it on. I want to make sure it's on. Now it's on. And then
Okay.
you also have that little thing there, which is the laser.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome. How are you guys doing today? Good, thank you. Nice to see some new faces in the crowd, which is wonderful. Thank you all for coming today. This is going to be a great talk. Dr. Matt Farina does such a wonderful job of putting interesting facts along with history so that you have a nice full picture of whatever it is that he's going to be discussing. And so throughout the years, he's come in and done all types of Civil War talks along with the history of Moore County. He did not too what was that, fall?
In the fall.
Yeah, that was wonderful. And so as you can see, Matt collects a lot of history, and this is not just for this topic. For every topic, it seems like he either wears a shirt or a tie that correlates with whatever the talk is that he's giving, along with bringing the types of information so everyone can come in, the different artifacts for you to look at and talk about. So without further ado, this is Dr. Matt Farina. My name is Lynn Drinkwater, and I work here for the Moore County Department of Aging. Is there a problem, Sue? Yes. What's that? On YouTube. Oh, sorry. She's looking at Facebook. So anyway, I want to thank Matt Gore from Visiting Angels today for bringing refreshments for today's topic. So thank you so much. And as you can see, Matt has also put in these 8 panels of history he has on loan. It's a traveling exhibit called When Are We Us? There are 3 different exhibits through the North Carolina, is it the cultural and
Right.
historical, and Matt reached out to them, and he has it on display at different places throughout Moore County. Each place has it for a week. So it just finished in Aberdeen Parks and Rec. This week it's going to be here all week, and then next week you go to Carthage,
The Southern Pines Library.
Southern Pines Library,
And then ends up in Carthage.
and then it ends up in Carthage. So it's wonderful. It's got a lot of different history packed on those 8 different panels. So thank you very much, and welcome, Dr. Matt Farina.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Everyone hear me? I don't want to get too close to this. I have to give you a commercial first. If you're interested in history, there are 2 organizations you should seriously consider belonging to. One is the Moore County Historical Association. And the dues there are $50. So you can go online and you can register online. We have all kinds of events going on there. And the next one that'll be coming up actually will be Clenny Creek Days, April 18th. That's at the Bryan House and the McClendon Cabin out on Mount Carmel Road, a few miles outside of Carthage. And that'll be on a Saturday. And there'll be all kinds of events going on there, great food, and there'll be reenactors, there'll be musicians in it, there'll be entertainment in addition. And then, right, Rev War and Civil War soldiers there. And then that'll be followed, I think it's May 30th. May 30th at the Shaw House in Southern Pines will be Colonial Day, and that will have a number of exhibits there and people demonstrate. Oh, okay. Better? Demonstrating, that's my voice. I gave a long talk 2 days ago. Demonstrating colonial period events, and there'll be a series of short talks being given by local historians at that. The second organization you should belong to is the Rufus Barringer Civil War Roundtable. In particular, if you're interested in Civil War history, I'm president of that organization. I have some newsletters here so you can see what we talk about. You do not have to be a Confederate. You do not have to be a federal person to belong to that. I like to tell audiences we are 50% galvanized. The term galvanized meant that if you were a Confederate soldier and you were sent to a Union prison, you could get out of prison by basically changing loyalty and signing a loyalty oath, and you were now a Union soldier, but you still weren't trusted to fight with the Union Army, so you were sent out west to fight Indians. The term for that was being galvanized. And the same thing occurred in the South. If you wanted to sit in Andersonville, but wanted to get out of Andersonville, you could become a Confederate and become galvanized. So we're about 50% galvanized, meaning Northerners like myself live down in the South now, and the other 50% are native North Carolinians who listen to talks about the North. Our topics are varied, and most of our speakers are nationally known authors or historians. Our next meeting just happens to be this coming Thursday, and the head of the museum, the CSS Noose Museum, will be talking about the Confederate Brown Water Navy, and he'll talk about the CSS Noose, which sank in the river there, was recovered with its many artifacts. Have some newsletters of that up here. And also my newsletters, I'm also the editor of the newsletter, so I've been running a series on Revolutionary War history, unusual aspects of Revolutionary War history, and we cover a number of interesting topics in our newsletter. So our newsletters are not just upcoming meetings, there's a little bit of history that runs through that. Our meetings are open to the public. We meet at the Civic Club in Southern Pines, just behind the basketball courts. So those are my two plugs. And I guess we'll get started. This is going to be kind of like a cook's tour of the history of black soldiers in the 19th century. Well, actually going back before the 19th century, but history of black soldiers in the United States from the Revolutionary War to the Spanish-American War. And I'm going to dwell a little bit longer on some aspects of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which was featured in the movie Glory back in the 1990s. And I'll talk a little bit more about where I'm going to concentrate on that when we get to that point. Okay. And I'm gonna read, because this is a new presentation for me, but also if I start speaking just ad lib, I tend to have multiple side lights and we'll be here until 6 o'clock. And I don't think anyone wants that. During the Revolutionary War, black men as individuals served in many regiments raised by the various states, but there's a record of only one unit that was composed almost exclusively of black men that served during the war, the so-called Rhode Island Black Regiment. This regiment, insofar as official records are concerned and they exist, is the first black regiment to be raised for the service of the United States. The regiment was, in fact, only a battalion of 4 companies and never exceeded a total strength of 225 men. These troops were recruited in 1778 to complete Rhode Island's quota for Continental troops for George Washington's army. The Rhode Island General Assembly voted to allow the enlistment of, quote, any able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man-slave, unquote, who chose to do so, and voted that, quote, every slave so enlisting shall immediately be discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free. The owners of enlisted slaves were to be compensated by the state equal to their market value. The 1st Rhode Island was the only regiment in the Continental Army to have segregated companies that make the regiment's strength, full strength, white troops also served in it, but they were segregated. Other regiments that allowed black men to enlist were essentially integrated. It participated in the Battle of Rhode Island on August 29, 1778, and was later present at Yorktown in October of 1781. By war's end, throughout the states, or the colonies at the time, at Yorktown, over 5,000 slaves had been granted freedom through military service. I just recently read a depressing and damning article in the 2007 issue of Colonial Williamsburg magazine, which I found in my library. It stated that few slaves that fought for the Americans, or for the British, in fact, were granted freedom despite the promises that were made by both governments that they would be free if they fought. Beginning in 1803, the British Navy exercised the right to seize American ships in the Atlantic and impress their crews, forcing them to serve under the British flag as British seamen. Over 10,000 Americans were impressed into the British Navy. President James Madison had promised the Hawks in Congress that he would declare war after receiving their support in the elections, and that war was the War of 1812. In 1812, neither the United States Army or the United States Navy officially accepted African Americans into their ranks. Navy recruiters, however, often ignored this ban to meet their recruitment goals and listed the men on muster rolls by their occupation rather than their race. African Americans constituted about 15% of the U.S. Navy during the war and contributed to important victories for the U.S. Navy. The close quarters on ships allowed no segregation. This is the famous Battle of Lake Erie, where the British fleet was very much destroyed. The acceptance of free black soldiers, however, was much different and much more limited. Most states and local militias rejected black participation until the British counteroffensive directly threatened their own communities. The only black inclusive militia existed in Louisiana. Although Louisiana was a slave state, there were approximately 4,600 free blacks living there by 1809. All free blacks who owned any property were recruited. Although the law in Louisiana only permitted whites to be officers in this battalion, 3 black second lieutenants still existed. Of Andrew Jackson's 6,000 troops that he had under his command to defend the state of Louisiana, 500 were free blacks. Blacks also fought for the British, once again convinced that a British victory would gain them freedom faster than an American victory. In the summer of 1814, about 5,000 Chesapeake Bay slaves joined the Royal Navy. Overall, at least 3,600 people, black civilians, escaped from American slavery with the aid of the British and were moved to Canada, in particular in Nova Scotia. There were 600 blacks who joined the British Colonial Marines. During the invasion of Maryland, the Black Marines inflicted a humiliating American defeat at the Battle of Bladensburg, northwest of Washington, D.C. on August 24th. And then the British Army marched the few remaining miles to Washington and burned many of the government buildings in Washington. The Battle of New Orleans, fought by Andrew Jackson's forces, was fought after the War of 1812 ended. News that the war had ended and that a treaty was being signed did not reach Louisiana before the battle. So neither the British forces nor the American forces knew that the war was over. The British suffered a humiliating loss in that battle, with many black troops participating in that. And when I thought about how to approach events that were going on during the Civil War, I decided to put things together in a timeline first, and then we would talk about the individual states that had black troops enlisted in those states. Turn a little bit here. The official war begins in April of 1861 with the shelling of Fort Sumter. And 2 days after that, President Lincoln will ask for 70,000 volunteers from the states. With the request for volunteers, the state of Virginia, which had not voted for secession, and the state of North Carolina, which had voted down secession a few months earlier, at that point, both states seceded. A month later, May 1861, a Confederate regiment is formed in Louisiana, the Louisiana Native Guard. At the same time, at Fortress Monroe in Virginia, General Butler has taken over Fortress Monroe, and he will introduce the concept of using contrabands. In August of 1861, following Butler's actions, the U.S. Congress will pass the first Confiscation Act, January 1862, the Louisiana legislature bans blacks from serving, and the Confederate Native Guard will be disbanded. In May of 1862, the Union Army and the Union Navy will capture New Orleans. The Union forces there will then form the first, about the same time in South Carolina, the first South Carolina Colored Regiment is formed. A couple months later, the second Confiscation Act is passed by the U.S. Congress. A month later, the first South Carolina regiment that was formed is disbanded, but 2 weeks later is reformed. And I'll talk a little bit about what happened that occurred. Meanwhile, out in Kansas, the first Kansas Colored Regiment is formed. In September 1862, President Lincoln will announce the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Governor Andrews in Massachusetts at this point will call for volunteers to form the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, a black regiment. In October of 1862, the first Kansas Colored Regiment will fight for the first time in the Civil War, blacks fighting Confederate soldiers. It's a skirmish, not a major battle, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Also in that month, the first South Carolina is officially incorporated into the U.S. service. January 1st, 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Secretary of War Stanton will now authorize the formation of black regiments. By May of 1863, the Louisiana Guard, this is the Union Guard now, Union black soldiers, will fight the first major battle against Confederates in the Battle of Port Hudson. At that same month, the 54th Massachusetts, which has been formed, will receive its flags. And in Washington, the Bureau of Colored Troops will be established. Also in South Carolina, the second South Carolina Regiment has been formed and mustered into the colonial service. July of 1863 is the fight at Battery Wagner, or Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor, where the 54th is in Massachusetts is engaged, and that's the basis of the movie Glory. In North Carolina, the first North Carolina Colored Volunteers are formed. In April of 1864, the 29th, 30th, and 34th Connecticut Black Regiments are formed. And in July of 1864 is the Battle of the Crater outside of Petersburg, where a number of the soldiers in this exhibit were wounded. So you can see that in various states, black units are being formed approximately at the same time. Now we'll look at each state individually and talk a little bit more about that. In the spring of 1861, as the American Civil War began, some of the free blacks residing in North Louisiana decided to form a militia unit that became known as the First Louisiana Native Guard, also known as the Defenders of the Native Land. The regiment consisted of 33 black officers and 731 privates. This was a Confederate regiment before any black soldiers would join Union armies. Mostly, the regiment marched up and down Canal Street in New Orleans. While the unit took to the ranks of the Confederacy, participants would later suggest that they volunteered in this way to shield their families from hostile suspicions and hoped to raise their social or political standing in the local community. Other historians believe that the Black Regiment was intended to counter Northern propaganda that claimed that the Confederacy was racist and was fighting for the preservation of slavery. In either event, it didn't matter because the Louisiana State Legislature passed a law in January of 1862 stating that all militia units from the state could only be comprised of white men. The Native Guard was then forced to disband and disbanded a month later in February of 1862. By May of 1862, when Union troops took over New Orleans, many of the former members of the Confederate Native Guard will join the Union First Native Guard from Louisiana. It was reorganized as the Corps of Africa and included formerly enslaved men in addition. However, like the Confederates, the Union mistreated the regiment. Native Guard members were paid less than white soldiers, issued inferior weapons, and suffered ongoing harassment. Still, they were the first black soldiers to fight in a major battle. By May of 1863, this is when Grant is in his Vicksburg campaign, the Union siege of Port Hudson, Louisiana, is the site of a major battle where the 1st Louisiana Guard unit, the Union Guard, will go into action. The white officers in the Northern press praised their tenacity and fighting ability. But the Native Guards were still not accepted on the same terms as their white counterparts. Later, they would be incorporated into the United States Army service as the 73rd USCT, or the United States Colored Troops. Now, what was going on in Virginia? Oh, yeah, before we go there, I tried to find a picture of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard. This is the Confederate unit. And the only thing I could find on Google was this photograph printed on the bottom as the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, 1861. I was a little suspicious of the photograph, however. And as you may realize, many things that you find on the internet are not accurate. I also found a recruiting poster. Now, photographs could not be printed in the papers at the time. So a photograph, the only thing you do with a photograph, you wanted to put something in the newspaper or make a recruiting poster or something like that, you had to have an artist basically draw the photograph and drawings could be printed. So this is a recruitment poster. Come join us, brothers. This is recruiting for the USCT, and it's the same group of men. And now you can see that there's an American flag in the background, different scenery in the background, a Union officer standing at the extreme end, and a drummer boy. And this photograph is, you'll find a lot of this version of the photograph if you Google black troops during the Civil War, and virtually all of these are Union. So I think what someone did was to just take a Union photograph and call it the Confederate force. So be wary of anything you look at on the internet. This is the Union Louisiana 1st Native Guard en route to the Battle of Port Hudson. And this is from, this is a drawing from, I believe this was Harper's newspaper. The black troops here were not supported by white troops, were not successful in this assault initially at Port Hudson. Port Hudson will later fall to Union forces. Now we'll go to Virginia. Handsome man. This is Union General Benjamin Butler, who was may have the honor of being called the homeliest Union officer in the Army of the Potomac. But he was a shrewd lawyer, and he was placed in charge of Fortress Monroe in May of 1861. Now, when he was placed in command there, 3 fugitive slaves sought protection at the Union Army at Fortress Monroe. They had escaped their plantation. Their owners sought their return under the fugitive slave laws, but Butler refused, stating that Virginia had just recently seceded from the Union. The slave laws then were null and void. But in addition, Butler stated that the slaves were, quote, contraband of war, that is, material of war. Instead of the enslaved supporting the Southern economy and war effort, Butler turned this Southern asset into a Union benefit. He put the contrabands to work, building fortifications and other related duties. Butler believed that the work of contrabands was a good return for the food and shelter the Union Army provided for them. Now, President Lincoln did not like this idea and did not openly embrace it. However, the radical Republicans in Congress did. And as a result, on August 16, 1861, Congress formally approved Butler's decision when they passed the first Confiscation Act. The act stated that, quote, that the Army could confiscate any slave who had been used for military service against the United States, unquote, and prompted the establishment of contraband communities in the spring of 1862. So that's what was going on in Virginia at the time relative to the recruitment of black soldiers. Let's go to South Carolina now. Most of the slaves in the South Carolina Sea Islands became free after the Battle of Port Royal on November 7, 1861, when many of the white residents and plantation owners fled the area after the arrival of the Union Army and Navy. The 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, that is a colored regiment, was organized on Hilton Head, South Carolina in May of 1862 by General David Hunter. He's the one on the extreme left, who was in charge of the Department of the South for the Union Army. Units of the 1st South Carolina were disbanded a few months later in August of 1862 under orders from President Abraham Lincoln's administration because Hunter had not been authorized by the U.S. War Department to recruit contraband, that is, free blacks, into the Army. And the recruits were forced, in the eyes of Congress, into the regiment, quote, in a manner reminiscent of their days as slaves, unquote. However, less than 2 weeks later, the regiment was reorganized under General Rufus Saxton, who had replaced Hunter on August 22nd, 1862, when U.S. Secretary of War Stanton authorized Saxton to, quote, arm, equip, and receive into the service of the United States such volunteers of African descent as you may deem expedient, not exceeding a number of 5,000, unquote. So now that it had been approved by the government, what Hunter had tried just a few months earlier was now legal. On November 8th, 1862, the man in the middle, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, assumed command of the 1st South Carolina Colored Infantry Regiment. And by January 31st, 1863, the 1st South Carolina was mustered officially into the United States service. Earlier that month, January 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation had gone into effect. That regiment was involved in war operations between the coastlines of Charleston, South Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida. Also in January of 1863, Colonel James Montgomery, he's the man on the extreme right, was authorized to raise a regiment of troops consisting entirely of free blacks and refugee former slaves, which were to serve under white officers. Montgomery organized the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry at Beaufort and Hilton Head, South Carolina. The new recruits were mustered into federal service on May 22, 1863. Throughout the remainder of 1863 and part of 1864, Montgomery practiced. He was originally from Kansas. He practiced his Jayhawker brand of irregular warfare in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. In June of 1863, Montgomery's brigade, along with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry under Robert Shaw, which had arrived in South Carolina by that point in time, they participated in a raid at Combahee Ferry, in which almost 800 slaves were freed, and the two units were involved later in the looting and burning of the coastal town of Darien, Georgia, which I'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about the 54th. Now let's jump to Kansas, which wasn't a state at this point, but was a territory and was being considered for statehood. This is the uniform of the South Carolina 1st and 2nd Volunteer Infantries. The South Carolina, when it's mustered into the federal service, will become the 33rd USCT. In Kansas, Colonel James Williams had been forming an American African regiment in Kansas, made up largely of escaped slaves from Missouri, Arkansas, and the Indian Territory, as well as some free blacks. In August of 1862, these men were mustered into Kansas militia as the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers. Despite the uncertainty of the regiment's future as a federal military force, Kansas assured the men were well armed. The skirmish at Island Mound, Missouri occurred on April 29, 1862. The 1st Kansas was outnumbered in the skirmish, but stood their ground and fought with, quote, desperate bravery, unquote, as headlined by the New York Times. The Union victory is notable as the first known event in which an African-American regiment for the Union engaged in combat against the Confederate force during the war. The unit's bravery attracted national attention, as some observers had doubted whether former slaves would make good soldiers. After the United States colored troops were established, the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers were redesignated as the 79th USCT on December 13, 1864. Let's come to our state, North Carolina. Most of the men who joined the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers, or the 1st NCCV, formed in New Bern between May and June of 1863, and most had escaped enslavement in northeastern North Carolina. As the campaign to recruit additional black troops from the freedmen who fled to the Union lines in coastal North Carolina grew, General Edward Wild was authorized to organize and command a black regiment. Although previously discouraged by New Bern's Union occupiers, the former slave William Henry Singleton had been drilling black men for months, unofficially as a non-military force. The 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteer soldiers smartly stepped off the New Bern Academy on July 24th, 1863, with their regimental flag presented by the Colored Ladies Relief Association of New Bern. Colonel James Beecher, a half-brother of Harriet Beecher Stoll, commanded the regiment. General Wild had also received special authority to select African-American officers for the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers. Among them was second in command Lieutenant Colonel William Reed, an immigrant with European military education and experience, who became the highest-ranking African-American in the Union Army. The 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers was redesignated as the 35th USCT on February 8th, 1864. Lieutenant Colonel Reed, the highest-ranking black officer, later died from wounds received leading the 35th USCT in a brave and costly rearguard action in the Battle of Olustee, Florida, in February of 1864. Sergeant William Henry Singleton, the man who had started drilling blacks before they were incorporated into the Union Regiment, was also wounded in that battle, but he will survive and later document his remarkable journey in a book, From Slavery to Freedom. So that's what was kind of happening in North Carolina. Things are going on in the northern states also. 6 regiments were considered regular state units and did not become USCT regiments. They were in Massachusetts, the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, the 54th, and its sister regiment, the 55th Massachusetts Infantry, and in Connecticut, the 29th, 30th, and 31st infantry regiments that were all black units. What had happened that USCT regiments were being formed? The Confiscation Act of 1862, also known as the Second Confiscation Act, was enacted on July 17, 1862. The act stated properties, including slaves belonging to supporters of the Confederacy in the South, belonged to the Union. The Union Army was permitted the right to, quote, employ contraband of war for use against the Confederacy and to recruit enslaved people into the Union Army to fight the war. The most significant change over the first Confiscation Act was that the final status of escaped slaves was defined. While the first act did not make any determination on the final status of slaves after the war was over, the second act explicitly said that all slaves, but it's referring here specifically to men who served as soldiers, covered it and would be permanently free. The Second Confiscation Act should not be confused with the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees all blacks. The Confiscation Act just said that if contraband were freed, they would be free after the war ended. Following the Battle of Antietam in 1862, on September 22nd, Lincoln announced that all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion within 100 days would be free. This was the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that, quote, all persons held as slaves, unquote, within the rebel states, quote, are and henceforth shall be free, unquote. The proclamation also called for the recruitment and establishment of black military units among the Union forces. After the Emancipation Proclamation, backing the Confederacy then was seen as favoring slavery, and it became more difficult for anti-slavery nations such as Great Britain and France, who had been friendly to the Confederacy, to get involved on behalf of the South. The use of black regiments was a step in the evolution of Union thinking towards the escaped slaves who crossed into the Union lines. Initially, they were returned to their owners under the fugitive slave laws before the shelling of Fort Sumter. Next, they were considered contraband and employed as laborers. Finally, the legal fiction that they were property was abandoned, and they were allowed to enlist in the Army, although in segregated units commanded by white officers. As a holdover from the contraband days, black privates were paid only $10 per month, the rate for laborers, rather than the $13 paid to white privates. But they and their supporters lobbied and eventually gained equal pay. There were many who feared or hoped that the experiment would fail. They gave many reasons. A rebellion by whites should be put down by whites. Blacks would not enlist. Blacks were too cowardly and would run when faced by white Southerners. Blacks were not intelligent enough to learn drills. Blacks with guns would revert to the savage instincts of the jungle. White soldiers would not serve alongside black soldiers. Blacks would demoralize white soldiers. The United States War Department issued General Order Number 143 on May 22, 1863, establishing the Bureau of Colored Troops to facilitate the recruitment of African American soldiers to fight for the Union Army. Perhaps to distinguish black from white state regiments, the War Department decided that the new regiments, with those 6 exceptions, would not carry customary state designations. They were to be numbered sequentially based on the date they were mustered in. The USCT ultimately would consist of 120 regiments, infantry regiments, 12 heavy artillery regiments, 7 cavalry regiments, 10 light artillery batteries, in addition to a corps of engineers. Almost 179,000 free blacks and freedmen would serve in the last 2 years of the war. Their service bolstered the Union war effort at a critical time. Initially, the USCT was relegated to menial jobs such as that of laborers, teamsters, cooks, and other support duties. However, even these duties were essential to the war effort. Eventually, the USCT were sent into combat. USCT regiments were led by white officers, while rank advancement was limited for black soldiers, who could only rise to the rank of a non-commissioned officer, that is, a sergeant. Approximately 110 black soldiers, however, did become commissioned officers before the end of the war, primarily as surgeons or chaplains. The process for white officers aiming to lead USCT units was considered more protracted and perhaps rigorous than for ordinary Union officers. This was because it was assumed that leading black soldiers would require a better officer than those leading white troops. Officers were not appointed by governors, but were usually commissioned after approval by a board of officers in several northern cities. At the end of their evaluations, those men who wished to lead black troops had to pass an exam in Washington. Only half of the men who took the exam were able to pass it. One of the most famous USCT actions took place at the Battle of the Crater during the siege of Petersburg. Regiments of USCT suffered heavy casualties attempting to break through the Confederate lines. Other notable engagements included Fort Wagner or Battery Wagner and the Battle of Nashville. Colored soldiers were among the first Union forces to enter Richmond after its fall in April of 1865. The 41st USCT Regiment was among those present at the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. Following the war, USCT regiments served among the occupation troops in former Confederate states. The USCT suffered a minimum of 2,700 combat deaths during the war and over 32,000 losses for all causes. As in white units, disease caused most of the fatalities in the Civil War. In the last year and a half of the war, approximately 18% of all African Americans enrolled in the military died. And one of the important battles that stressed the ability of black troops was the 54th Massachusetts, and that was the basis of the movie Glory. I've seen that movie several times, and the Behringer Civil War Roundtable, we actually showed the movie. Most people have actually seen the movie only on their TV screens, but you can rent the Sunrise Theater, and if you bring your own DVD, you can show the movie free. And so my Civil War Roundtable did that I think it was 2 summers ago. And as I saw that movie again, one of the things that struck me about the movie was that Shaw seemed somewhat naive in it, and that always bothered me. But In the past several years, a couple of excellent books have come out about Shaw's character and individual, and the significance of the 54th Massachusetts was that it pretty much erased all concerns over whether or not black troops would fight. And so I want to dwell a little bit more about Shaw's background and some aspects of the movie that are in conflict with what was portrayed in the movie, or were not in the movie at all. The monument on Boston Common, sculpted by Augustus St. Gaudens, depicts the 28th day in May of 1863, when the largest crowd in the city's history at that time assembled on Essex and Beacon Streets to cheer the pride of abolitionist Boston. Shaw rides his horse in step with his regiment, marching southward forever with straight backs, forward eyes, and long strides. In the men's right hands and on their right shoulders gleamed 1,000 Enfield rifles. Frederick Douglass watched as his eldest son Lewis marched past and recalled his own words as he saw each black soldier with, quote, an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, unquote. And while I mentioned Frederick Douglass, I wanted to mention this in the beginning. 2 days ago, it was Valentine's Day, and I read this morning that Valentine's Day was Frederick Douglass's birthday. That I didn't know. The family of Shaw watched and hugged one another as their son, brother, and husband saluted them by briefly stopping his horse and raising his sword to his lips in front of the house at 44 Beacon Street. When the day passed, they would see his youthful figure again only when the statue found its place on the Common in 1897. 60 years before the unveiling, Shaw was born into one of the nation's richest families. The first Robert Shaw was Boston's wealthiest merchant, operating a dry goods store, an auction and commission house, and a real estate business, together worth $1.5 million in 1852. Robert Gould was born on October 10, 1837. He grew up playing with the children of William Lloyd Garrison, while his mother's close friends included Harriet Beecher Stowe and Lydia Marie Child. Young Robert listened intently at his mother's knee and wondered why slavery caused such passion in the women who inhabited his world. Few children in 19th century America had stronger feminist role models than young Shaw. When he was 13, his uncle convinced his parents to send Robert to the preparatory school of St. John's College in New York. When he was 18, he started 2 years of boarding school in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, with a rigorous curriculum of geometry, algebra, chemistry, geology, and 6 languages. Robert began to think about a career. He did not want to be a reformer, which had been the calling of both of his parents. His father had gone to Harvard, so that made the likely choice. He moved to another boarding school in Hanover, Germany, where he studied daily from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., but then attended on a regular basis the theater, opera, or concert. He became a regular at parties and overspent his allowance with regularity. Shaw did not appear to have given much thought to abolition, but the real emotion in Shaw's letter to his family came bursting forth on December 11, 1855. Quote, I did get very angry tonight with a man who railed against America. I must hate them when they talk so much about us. And the worst of it is that they don't say anything about the real abuse, slavery, but begin on some little insignificant thing, unquote. Shaw maintained this strong sense of national patriotism throughout his short life. As the years to Civil War wound down, Shaw increasingly felt that what everyone called slave power soiled the fabric of an otherwise great nation. If it took the end of slavery to redeem the honor of America and to end the embarrassment of Northerners who felt to being in the same union with the slave system, then Shaw stood for that. He returned home to the new family home in Staten Island in May of 1856. He passed the entrance exam to Harvard, but found the rigors of Harvard much different than boarding schools. Academically, he never rose into the upper half of his class. He excelled in extracurricular activities, including rowing, playing the violin, and being accepted into all 8 societies sponsored by the college, including the Hasty Pudding Club. He wanted to rid his nation of slavery, but showed little interest in people who were slaves. His wealthy uncle convinced Robert to withdraw from Harvard, and in March 1859 he entered his uncle's firm, Henry P. Sturgis and Company in New York City. After the election of Lincoln and the secession of South Carolina, American men and boys raced to join militia groups. Robert enlisted in the ultra-exclusive 7th New York National Guard, where he drilled twice a week. In April 1861, after South Carolina fired upon Fort Sumter and Lincoln asked for the states for 70,000 volunteers, that next day, April 16th, the commander of the regiment informed the governor that the 7th New York National Guard was ready. Lincoln asked for 90-day volunteers, but the 7th was so confident that the war would end quickly, they agreed to serve only 30 days. On April 19th, the Darling 7th, as it was known, 991 men strong, marched down Broadway, boarded a new steamer, docked at Annapolis, and then marched to Washington to become the first regiment to reach the capital. After 30 days, the 7th New York National Guard disbanded, and many returned to civilian life, but Shaw remained a soldier. He quickly gained an officer's commission as a second lieutenant in the newly approved 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first 3-year regiments organized. During the 20 months with the regiment, Shaw found the life of an officer much different than that of a common soldier. Quote, "We have cots to sleep on, much better fare, and servants in abundance from among the men," unquote. He desired a promotion and got it, advancing to captain, but those promotions were based more on the deaths of senior officers than on Shaw's abilities. He learned to be a good officer who carried out orders, but he became neither a spectacular tactical nor strategic commander. Those who knew him emphasized his loyalty, gentleness, obedience, not his military acumen. In 1862, the regiment occupied Harper's Ferry. Shaw's parents and circle of friends had fervently supported John Brown. Inspired by what he saw there, Shaw hoped the government would soon, quote, "call on all the blacks in the country to come and enlist in our army," unquote. Robert believed that strict adherence to rules and good conduct made for more efficient armies. To him, the 2nd Massachusetts was the Army's best regiment because of its adherence to order. After a year of campaigning, Lieutenant Shaw had neither fired his pistol nor raised his sword against the enemy. Friends in other regiments, like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., had received honorable wounds, and Shaw wanted the same chance. During the battles of Fort Royal and Winchester, the 2nd Massachusetts got its first taste of combat. A mini ball passed through his clothes and struck the pocket watch hanging from his vest. He remembered only a violent blow and a burning sensation in my side. The attack at Fort Royal came so unexpectedly it caught the untried officer without his weapons, his sword and revolver packed away neatly in his luggage. Borrowing a toy sword from a drummer boy, he managed to direct his company through the hard fighting with 9 casualties of the 50 engaged under his command. A sergeant later complimented him on his courage and coolness under fire. He had passed the test of being an officer to the enlisted men who had ridiculed him as one of the college boys, unquote. The 2nd Massachusetts was involved in a frightful bloodletting at Cedar Mountain on August 9, 1862. In 30 minutes, 16 of its 23 officers were killed or wounded. Quote, "I can't conceive how I got through without a scratch," unquote, he wrote. 5 weeks later, Shaw's regiment fought its way back and forth across the cornfield at Antietam. Captain Shaw received his 2nd wound from a spent bullet arching into his neck and bouncing away. He had seen the elephant and was saddened by the death of many friends, but he never lost his enthusiasm for the fight. Sometime shortly after Antietam, while he was recovering, Robert proposed marriage to Annie Haggerty, whom he had met before the war. She accepted 2 weeks later, but the couple kept their engagement a secret from everyone but their parents until February of 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, authorized the raising of black regiments. Among the regiments raised in the North, the 54th Massachusetts led the way. Governor John Andrew was a strong abolitionist. On January 26th, Stanton authorized the governor to raise regiments which, quote, may include persons of African descent organized into special corps, unquote. Governor Andrew wanted to prove that black men would fight, which in turn would prove that they were men and thus entitled to be free citizens. But as a politician, he hoped that black enlistments would also take the pressure off his state to meet its enlistment quotas. If black men did not enlist, Andrew would need to fill quotas with factory workers from the most industrialized state in the Union. Andrew carefully selected white officers who had proven themselves in battle and came from powerful and respected families. He was given 2 names, Captain Robert Shaw and Captain Norwood Hallowell of the 20th Massachusetts Infantry. Hallowell was first recommended because, quote, he has convictions, unquote. Andrew opted for the one with the better family connections. He shrewdly wrote to Shaw's parents, first informing them of his choice. Francis and Sarah Shaw joyfully received the news. Andrew explained that the regiment would be the most important and would serve as a model for all future colored regiments. To command, Andrew wanted a gentleman, quote, of the highest tone and honor, unquote, from, quote, circles of educated and anti-slavery society, unquote. Francis took the letter to his son, who was in camp in Virginia at this time. The governor's letter offered Shaw the colonelcy of the 54th, with Hallowell as lieutenant colonel. Shaw refused, thinking the position, quote, anything but an agreeable task, unquote. His father did not pressure him. Shaw had seen many of his friends die, and he felt loyal to their memory and to the men who remained in the 2nd Massachusetts to fight on future fields. He discussed the offer with his close friend and tent mate, Charles Morse, who doubted blacks would enlist and questioned their fighting ability. But Shaw's mother, Sarah, also had written a letter that her husband carried to Virginia. She wrote, quote, well, I feel as if God has called you up to a holy work. I know the task is arduous, but it is God's work, unquote. When he rejected Governor Andrew, he knew he also was rejecting his mother. Shaw agonized over what he had done. 2 days later, his father received a telegram that Robert had changed his mind and told his father to destroy the rejection letter. The reasons for the change may have included pressure he felt from home, the memory of his dead friends, his anti-slavery sympathy, the chance to be near his wife and mother while the regiment was being recruited in Boston, and perhaps his sense of duty. The governor had received the bad news first and felt bitter disappointment, but was elated by the change of heart. But he had some concerns about Shaw. He tried to convince Shaw to accept the lieutenant colonelcy. If Shaw agreed, the command would go to Hallowell, who had had no misgivings. But Shaw held on to the original offer. Many prominent black men in the community spoke out against the enlistment. They were angry that the unit would have no black officers and that they were asked to fight when they were not allowed to vote or hold office in most northern states. Quote, equality first, guns afterwards, was their motto. Other leaders were equally upset, but urged enlistment, saying, if you cannot have a whole loaf, will you not take a slice? That is the great question for you to decide, unquote. A special black committee was formed by abolitionists to raise money, advertise, and recruit. Quote, an opportunity is now being offered to colored men to prove their manhood and loyalty by enlisting in the 54th Regiment, unquote. Almost every abolitionist in Boston anteed up between $20 and $500 to raise $100,000. Each recruit was paid a bounty of $50. A committee paid transportation costs to the camp and return transportation if the recruit was rejected. The state promised to pay $8 a month to families left behind. Local communities could add additional bounties. The men would be paid $13 a month. Frederick Douglass published his famous Men of Color to Arms editorial and enlisted 2 of his sons. In all, Douglass sent over 100 men into the regiment. Governor Andrew required all the officers come from Massachusetts. Hallowell's brother, Edward, was made a major and placed 3rd in command. The 54th had the pick of the northern black population. Several hundred recruits came from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. 50 came from western New York. 27 came from New Bedford. In April, 50 from Buffalo, Cincinnati, and Detroit arrived. Among the early enlistments were 3 fugitive slaves and 3 emancipated slaves. A former slave from Virginia, William H. Carney, would be the first African American to win the Medal of Honor. The oldest man to join was 46-year-old Peter Vogelsang, who became a sergeant of Company H. He would become one of 3 black men promoted to officer rank in the 54th. 38 men over age 40 would serve in the 54th. Given the fact that the 54th was the first black regiment raised from an untapped source, it became one of the most physically fit and academically able units to serve during the Civil War. In all, 40% of black Bostonians of military age joined the 54th, or later its sister regiment, the 55th. Dr. Lincoln Stone, a friend of the Shaw family, administered the rigorous exam of every recruit at Camp Meigs. Unlike the movie, those who passed the exam quickly were made to look like soldiers. Hallowell had them marched to a pond, disrobed, washed, and uniformed. Their old clothes were burned. On average, 12 men daily exchanged civilian clothes for uniforms. The men occupied 12 wooden barracks that housed 100 men each. Necessaries were requisitioned and received weekly. Everything was first rate, as Shaw's regiment got the newest and best of everything in quantities that made them want for nothing. This was the governor's model regiment. They did drill with old muskets during the winter until 1,000 new Enfields arrived in May. Shaw, however, didn't impose the strict discipline he had experienced in the 2nd Massachusetts. He believed that a soldier's behavior in battle depends almost entirely on the discipline. Records are incomplete, but Camp Commandant General Pierce called them contrary to what the Army permitted and ordered Shaw to stop any and all severe and unusual punishments not laid down by regulations. You may recall in the movie that one of the soldiers who goes AWOL is whipped. Whipping was not allowed in the Union Army. So this was Shaw forcing his own discipline on that soldier. And this is what he was reprimanded for. In camp, the few recruits who could not read took reading lessons offered by volunteer teachers. After drill, many sang, played instruments, and danced in the barracks. The desertion rate for black soldiers exactly mirrored that for white soldiers. When Shaw first assumed command, he made many racist remarks in letters to friends, referring to his men as niggers and darkies. He avoided these words in letters to his mother. He believed in the Harvard professor's theories of racial hierarchy based on anthropomorphic measurements. But by the end of March, he admitted to his mother and friends that, quote, the intelligence of the men is a great surprise to me, unquote. Shaw began to respect their abilities and became attached to and defensive of them. Forced by their actions to question, then conquer his own misconceptions, he bristled if an outsider abused them. Shaw stopped calling them niggers. On April 6th, Shaw invited the public to the 54th's first dress parade, which was a huge success. Thereafter, thousands visited the camp by taking excursion trains from Boston. Finally, on May 6th, they received their new Enfield rifled muskets. Newspapers observed an air of completeness and order and morale such as not seen in any white regiment. The men were proud of themselves and took special pride in the designation of the unit as the 54th Massachusetts and not the Massachusetts 1st Colored Infantry. They received their flags on May 18th. On May 28th, 20,000 onlookers lined the parade route on that cloudless day to watch the 1,000-man regiment come down the street, led by a large contingent of policemen, 2 bands, and a drum corps. Shaw rode his ebony horse. His mother 1 week later would write, "If I never see him again, I shall feel that he has not lived in vain," unquote. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote that Shaw seemed as, quote, "beautiful and awful as an angel of God come down to lead the host of freedom to victory," unquote. But not everyone praised the 54th. Many of Boston's Irish feared black equality that might threaten their tenuous position in low-paying jobs they occupied. They spread rumors that one Southern regiment of white men would rout 20 regiments of black men in half an hour. The 54th boarded a brand new transport steamer and a week later landed at Hilton Head. The regiment was inspected by General Hunter at that time, and then the ship steamed upriver to Beaufort. There the men met the contraband regiment of Colonel James Montgomery, the 2nd North Carolina, which had just returned from its raid. The regiment had burned property and had freed slaves. The next day, Shaw met with Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who manned his regiment, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. On June 9th, Montgomery offered Shaw an invitation to participate in a raid on Darien, Georgia. Darien was a seaport town that had been Georgia's 2nd leading seaport. Shaw was eager to act for the action. By the time the force arrived, most of the townspeople and their slaves had moved out. They landed to no opposition. Both officers ordered their men to remove from the homes anything that might be useful in camp. Soon the men had sofas, tables, pianos, chairs, mirrors, carpets, beds, and even a cow. While participating willingly in the plunder, Shaw was indignant when Montgomery said, "I shall burn this town." Although Shaw, in the 2nd Massachusetts, had set fire to Winchester a year earlier, he objected in Darien because they had met no rebel resistance and thus felt it was dishonorable to burn the town. North and South newspapers carried the story. Montgomery defended his actions to make Southerners feel that this was real war, unquote. He had also acted under General Hunter's orders. Shaw felt that white soldiers could set fire with impunity, but black soldiers would fan the flames of racial hatred if they did so. Lincoln was aware of public opinion, and that was a key reason why he would replace Montgomery. Shaw admired replaced Hunter. Over time, Shaw reevaluated Montgomery. He admired Montgomery's dedication, and he envied his clear vision of vengeance and mission. He watched Montgomery shoot a man for disorderly conduct and execute a soldier for desertion. Shaw liked the adherence to discipline, but still believed his northern black men were better than the contraband soldiers who he felt were childlike and ignorant. Back at Hilton Head, Shaw began to feel homesick. He missed his mother and his wife, but managed to find female companionship in the northern school teachers who came to Port Royal to teach the newly freed. He met Charlotte Fortin from Philadelphia, a 26-year-old attractive quadroon, the only African-American missionary teaching there. She came from a prominent abolitionist family with wide social connections. She had been educated in Salem, Massachusetts. All the officers were after her, but she was equally taken with Shaw. But before the relationship could develop further, the war intervened. On July 8th, the regiment was transported to James Island near Charleston. It was about this time that the men were informed the government had ordered that its black men in arms were to be paid $10 a month to pay for laborers instead of the $13 a month paid to white troops. In addition, they would be docked $3 per month for clothing expenses instead of being supplemented by that same amount as was the practice for white soldiers. The net pay would be $7 a month. The men had not yet received their initial pay. An angry Shaw refused to let the men be paid and held that the government, if the government continued this insanity, his men should be mustered out, since they were enlisted on the understanding that they would be paid like whites. Shaw complained to Governor Andrew, who agreed with Shaw. Andrew wrote to Lincoln and Stanton. The men would need to refuse pay until September 29th, 1864. He's in North Carolina, July 1863. So the men will not be paid for over a year when Congress finally equalized the pay. On James Island, the 54th provided picket duty. Unexpectedly at dawn on July 16th, a 900-man Confederate force slammed into the pickets. 3 companies of the 54th, about 250 men, quickly rallied and stubbornly held their ground in good order. They fought a delaying action along with the 10th Connecticut until the Confederates retreated when artillery from Union gunboats arrived. General Quincy Gilmore, who had replaced Hunter as commander of the Department of the South, and General Alfred Terry, in charge of Union Division on James Island, congratulated Shaw's men who had fought well in coordination with the white soldiers against white Confederates. Soldiers of the 10th Connecticut wrote, quote, "But for the bravery of the Massachusetts 54th, our whole regiment would have been captured," and quote, "they fought like heroes," unquote. General Strong asked Shaw if he wanted the 54th to lead the charge on Battery Wagner in Charleston Harbor. Shaw could have declined, but Shaw knew the key to Charleston was at the end of that beach. If black men could storm the fort and open the door to the birthplace of the rebellion, the symbolism would be enormous. His duty was never clearer. He answered yes. Just hours before saying yes, a melancholy Shaw had told Hallowell, quote, "If I could only live a few weeks longer with my wife and be at home a little while, I might die happy, but it cannot be. I do not believe I will live through our next fight," unquote. Still, Shaw hid his fear from his other officers and men. Shaw led his men through the 13 white regiments that would support the 54th in the assault. Many of the white soldiers cheered the men. At 600 yards from the fort, Shaw ordered his soldiers to form 2 lines of battle, fix bayonets, and lie down in the sand. The men exchanged letters, shook hands with each other. Shaw had written 2 short letters to his mother and sisters and had given those to the news correspondent Edward Pierce. Shaw dismounted his horse, smoked a cigar, and walked among the men in an informal way. He challenged them to take the fort or die there. They swore they would try. Shaw positioned himself in front and ordered forward. They marched forward until the batteries at Wagner and Fort Sumter opened up at about 200 yards from the fort. Shaw ordered double quick. At 80 yards, the 1,700 Confederates in the fort unleashed grape shot and canister. Quote, "Our men fell like grass before a sickle," said Lieutenant Grace. The men waded through knee-deep salt water, crossed the deep moat, tore through Nebatus, and climbed the sloping sand walls into rifle fire. With a small group of men, Shaw somehow made it to the top of the parapet before a bullet killed him and dropped his body into the fort. Those near him remembered his last words differently, but all agreed Shaw had waved his sword and urged his men forward. Nearly half his regiment succeeded in pushing its way into Wagner and held their ground on the wall for almost an hour before being forced to withdraw. The white troops supporting them, the 6th Connecticut, 48th and 100 New York, 3rd and 7th New Hampshire, 76th Pennsylvania, 9th Maine, and 62nd and 66th Ohio, were unable to join or remove the defenders from their strong position. The Confederates lost 174 men. Of the 600 men of the 54th who charged the fort, 272 were killed wounded, or captured, for a 45% casualty rate. Additional casualties from the white regiments brought Union losses to over 1,500. Confederate gravediggers buried 800 Union soldiers in the sand in front of the fort. Showing contempt for the abolitionist regiment, the fort's commander, General Johnston Haygood, ordered Shaw's body thrown into the trench and the bodies of 20 of his men thrown face down on top of him. The survivors of the 54th retreated to the south end of Morris Island, found friends, and reformed. Luis Emilio, the only officer above the rank of captain not wounded or killed in the attack, commanded the regiment. Many hurriedly wrote letters. They rested for only one day. Some of the comments were, "Not a man flinched. Remember, if I die in a good cause. I wish we had 100,000 colored troops. We would put an end to this war. We will continue until the last brother breaks his chains." Several wounded men felt, "Oh, I thank God so much for the privilege." Another wrote, "If all our people get their freedom, we can afford to die." And another, "I still feel more eager for the struggle than I ever yet have, for I now wish to have revenge for our gallant colonel." Charlotte Fortin and Beaufort heard about Shaw's death from seriously wounded men of the 54th who were transported there. Shaw had given orders to Hallowell that if he died at Wagner, one of his horses should be presented to Charlotte, a gift she treasured lifelong. The men participated in the siege that ultimately brought down the fall of the fort on September 6, 1863. Toward the end of July, Norwood Hallowell, who had been sent north to bring the 55th Massachusetts down, arrived. There was no proof that the Confederates killed or enslaved any 54th prisoners that they took, except those 54th prisoners who died at Hendersonville due to lack of medical attention and provisions. Edward Hallowell, he had been the third in command, recovered from his 3 wounds and was promoted to colonel and assumed command of the refortified 54th. For the next 18 months, they would fight in the Department of the South at battles of Olustee, James Island, and Honey Hill. They celebrated Independence Day in Charleston with a reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. They did not participate in the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. On August 20th, 1865, the regiment was officially mustered out of service. On September 2nd, they marched to the State House and the Boston Common. Hallowell was in front of the regiment as they marched, not as nervous, untried green troops, but with the swing and bearing of seasoned soldiers. No dissenters booed or yelled racial epithets this time. You can see how they had to attack up a relatively narrow beach, all in a single line. Conspicuous in the ranks marched Sergeant William H. Kearney, whose deeds at Wagner would garner the First Medal of Honor for black troops. First Lieutenant Stephen Swales, the first African-American to be commissioned an officer in the acting army, was the pride of his company. Peter Vogelsang, the oldest man in the unit, was also a lieutenant and marched alongside his men. Shaw's family grieved their loss, but they were consoled by many letters that mourned with them or glorified their son. When they heard the news that Shaw was, quote, buried with his niggers, unquote, Francis Shaw wrote to Correspondent Pierce that they could hope for no holier place for Shaw's body. He also wrote to General Gilmore, quote, "You will forbid the desecration of my son's grave," unquote. When Wagner fell to Union forces, the graves remained undisturbed. The propaganda effect of Wagner was enormous. Newspapers quoted a white soldier at Wagner saying, "We don't know any black men here. They're all soldiers." The northern population now accepted putting black men in uniform and acknowledged that black men could fight and kill like white men. Interestingly, in 1935, W.B. Du Bois wrote, quote, "How extraordinary! Only murder makes men. The slave pleaded. He was humble. He protected the women of the South, and the world ignored him. The slave killed white men, and behold, he was a man," unquote. Few acts have been more right for memorial than Shaw's death and burial at Wagner. In 1863, men and friends of the regiment donated $3,000 to build a memorial on Morris Island. Instead, the money was used to finance a more usable remembrance, the Shaw School for Black Children in Charleston. On May 31st, 1897, St. Gaudens's masterpiece was dedicated. 65 officers and men of the old 54th attended. Most had read and contributed to Luis Emilio's regimental history, a brave black regiment. At least 40 poems have been written to eulogize Shaw. On the monument, Shaw rides his horse in step with his men, with an angel of the Lord gliding over them. Shaw deserved the monument for his steadfastness to honor, even though he never had the clear-eyed crusader's vision committed to abolition. What Shaw had was courage and loyalty. He was responsible enough to give black troops a fair trial. He did his duty to his men, his mother, and himself. The men of the 54th uplifted him to a higher plane and educated him, even as their efforts caused others to re-examine their own prejudices. Now, in recognition of the contribution of the USCT made to the Union victory, an act of Congress dated July 28, 1866, authorized the creation of 6 black regular Army regiments as part of additions to the military. General Phil Sheridan was authorized to raise the 9th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Edward Hatch. The organization of the 10th Cavalry, commanded by Colonel Ben Grierson, was begun at Fort Leavenworth. Grierson had led a successful 600-mile cavalry raid during the war. The foot regiments were the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st. Later, the 4 regiments would be consolidated as the military shrank into the 24th and 25th regiments. All were quickly named Wild Buffaloes by their Cheyenne and Comanche enemies because of their nappy hair, which was similar to the woolly hair of the buffalo. At first, the Indians treated the black soldiers with contempt, but after a taste of their fighting qualities, they developed a great respect for those they continued to call the Buffalo Soldiers. The 9th adopted the typical cavalry flag. All the cavalry flags, including the 7th Cavalry under Custer, used this type of flag. With at the bottom of the flag was the cavalry regiment number. The 10th, however, decided if we're going to be called Buffalo Soldiers, we're going to put the buffalo on our flag. So this is their coat of arms, and I have an example of their buffalo flag up here somewhere on the table. Until the early 1890s, these troops constituted 20% of all regular forces on active duty in the West. They had participated in approximately 130 actions against hostile Indians in Kansas, Indian Territory, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, the Dakota territories, as well as Mexico. 22 members would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for extreme bravery and courage under fire. Besides their battle record, they performed the everyday tasks of protecting settlers, travelers, and workers alike. They built roads, erected forts, put up thousands of miles of telegraph poles, all of which brought civilization to the American frontier. A correspondent left one of the best testimonials when I campaigned with the 9th Cavalry in New Mexico in 1881. Quote, "On the march or in camp, they are cheerful and obedient. Their horses are well cared for, and in 2 companies I have seen but 1 man lounging in his saddle. If ordered on detached or dangerous service, they never shirk it. They do not appear to sleep, and in camp seem to be awake all night. There is every evidence to show that they will and do fight well. Their own, as well as other officers and citizens who have fought with them, attest to this fact," unquote. For 8 years following the end of the Indian Wars, the 4 regular regiments of the Buffalo Soldiers continued garrison at various frontier posts and to police the tamed American West. In early 1892, a confrontation developed between mine owners and labor unions in the Coeur d'Alene mining district in Idaho. Several mine explosions had occurred there with a loss of life. Federal aid was invoked, and the battalion of the 25th Infantry was sent to guard trains, make arrests, scout, and furnish escorts for the next 2 years. The press commented, quote, during the entire operation that the guard was on duty, no act of the troops was open to criticism, and there was not a single instance of an unjust exercise of authority. In the summer of 1896, the entire 10th Cavalry was in the field rounding up Cree Indians that had fled the reservation in Canada and were raiding across the border in the United States. Large numbers were escorted back to Canada and handed over to the Canadian authorities. One of the leaders of this assignment was Lieutenant John J. Persing, commanding Troop D. The future commander of American forces in World War I acquired his nickname Black Jack Persing for his earliest service with the 10th Cavalry. And this is a picture of Ossian Flipper, who was the first black graduate from West Point. Now, as I said in the presentation, the 54th had the first black officers who were made officers in the Army, but this was the first graduate from West Point. There were at least 6 other blacks who had attended West Point prior to Ossian, but they washed out. But he was the first to rise from slavery to going to Atlanta University and then being appointed to West Point, graduating from West Point and becoming an engineer. It's fascinating history to read. The war broke out between the United States and Spain after the explosion and sinking of the U.S. Maine in Havana Harbor with a loss of 250 American soldiers. Although it was later shown to be accidental, President McKinley believed it was sabotage. Major General Shafter commanded the 5th Corps, which included all 4 of the black regiments. The 9th and 10th were part of the Cavalry Corps division commanded by former Confederate General Joseph Wheeler. 12 African-American volunteer units also filled out the ranks of the U.S. Army during the short war. This was the first time that the bulk of the American public realized that their standing army included regiments composed wholly of black soldiers. The 4 regiments were staged near Tampa and were not so popular with the whites. Racial tension was nothing new in the Southeast, but the arrival of self-confident black soldiers unaccustomed to blatant discrimination created an explosive atmosphere. The Tampa newspaper editorialized, quote, the colored infantrymen stationed in Tampa have made themselves very offensive to the people of the city. The men insist on being treated as white men are treated, unquote. The 9th and 10th were forced to leave their horses behind due to a lack of transport, and that included the Rough Riders too. The 17,000-man force included nearly 3,000 black regulars, or 18% of the Army. Landed on the southeastern tip of Cuba on June 22, 1898. The key to the capture of the city of San Diego was the San Juan Heights. On July 1st, the 2nd Division, supported by the Cavalry Division, attacked several different defending hilltops. The first line consisted of 4 troops of the 9th Cavalry firing from a sunken road position. Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, on his horse, and the horseless Rough Riders came up behind the firing line. A captain of the 9th said that they could not take these hills by firing at them, but it would be necessary to rush them. The captain said he could not do so without orders, and he did not know where his commander was. Roosevelt replied, then I am the ranking officer here, and I give the order to charge. Unquote. The 9th and 10th Cavalry went up Kettle Hill with the Rough Riders to their right. The 9th reached the crest of Kettle Hill and descended down the valley to the 2nd Spanish line. By 1:50 p.m., the Americans had secured the entire length of the height. Of the 450 men of the 10th Cavalry, 7 were killed, 72 wounded, and 4 were missing. After the battle, Rough Rider Frank Knox, who will become Secretary of the Navy under FDR, said, quote, "I never saw braver men anywhere," unquote. Roosevelt himself commented, quote, "No one can tell whether it was the Rough Riders or the men of the Ninth who came forward with the greater courage to offer their lives in the service of their country," unquote. Incredibly, Roosevelt later would write, quote, "Negro troops were shirkers in their duties and would only go as far as they were led by white officers," unquote. This is a famous photograph taken after the battle. If you go online, the roughly middle third of the photograph is what you will see most like, and that's where the white Rough Riders are. When you look at the full picture, the 9th Cavalry is on both flanks of that. So the 9th Cavalry was excluded from the commonly printed pictures of the fight. Most of the battle accounts published in the weeks after the action ignored the deeds of black troops in Cuba. Medal of Honor recipients included William Tompkins, Fitz Lee, Dennis Bell, George Wanton, Sergeant Edward Baker, and Sergeant John Graham. 29 others received the Certificate of Merit, or 1/7 of the total awarded for the war. After World War I, the War Department did a systematic review of official reports, and 8 other black soldiers were retrospectively awarded the newly instituted Silver Star. After the Spanish surrendered in Cuba on July 16th, U.S. forces turned to Puerto Rico. Following the Treaty of Paris in December 1898, which ended the Spanish-American War, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands were ceded to the United States. About 20,000 Filipino insurgents attacked U.S. forces in February 1899. Congress authorized 25 new regiments of 2-year volunteers. The Black 48th and 49th saw service in the Philippines, along with portions of the 24th and 25th regiments, along with Black Jack Persing, who served in the Philippines. In the face of common adversity, white troops during the year of the Buffalo Soldiers developed a great respect for the Buffalo Soldiers towards the end of the Indian Wars. In 1891, a member of the garrison at Fort Custer in Montana wrote, quote, "The colored troops of the 25th Infantry get along extremely well with their white comrades of the 1st Cavalry, and the color line is exceedingly dim. So may it ever be. Men who wear the same uniform, eat the same rations, draw the same pay, and fight for the same country can ill afford to let color of the skin form the cause of estrangement," unquote. I want to end with this quote from Henry Gates. "Not even God can change the past, but we can change how the past is remembered." It would not be until July 26, 1948, when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, creating the President's Commission on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services. The order mandated the desegregation of the U.S. military. But that's another story in itself. Thank you. I'll try and answer any questions you may have. If you've not seen the exhibit, what's up on the table here, there are 5 photographs that in the mid-1990s, the National Archives were microfilming the pension records of the USCT, the 120 regiments, and they found 5 photographs that had not been known to the National Archives that were in the pension records as carte de vis. I happened to be invited to a dinner that the woman who was in charge of volunteers working in the National Archives. She headed them up. And she said, "You're interested in the Civil War. Would you like a backroom tour of the National Archives?" Yes. And she showed me these 5 photographs. And then she said, "Would you like copies of them and their records?" Yes. So she copied the stories. As it turned out, I set that up as an exhibit back in Albany for my Civil War Roundtable. And one of the members of the roundtable who lived in Troy, New York, was reading the pension records there, and he said, "That's signed by Bontecu." I said, "What?" He said, "That's signed by Dr. Reed Brockway Bontecu, who was a physician in the Union Army during the Civil War." And his picture is up here. Bontecu also was an amateur photographer, and when the Surgeon General Hammond found out about that. One of the things Hammond wanted to do was to put together a photographic history of wounds from the Civil War to be used to help train physicians in the future, because only in war are you going to see these types of wounds, what they looked like, how they were treated, and what the results were. So when he found out that Bontecu was also a photographer, he assigned Bontecu to Harewood Hospital in Washington. And Bontecu took the bulk of the photographs that exist in the photographic history of the War of the Rebellion. And we had the opportunity, actually, of being offered by someone who bought at an auction a collection of letters Bontecu wrote after the war. So Troy, I was living and practicing in Albany, New York. Troy's right across the river. So we bought the roundtable, bought the collection from the man who found them at auction, and we donated them to the Rensselaer County Historical Association. I have a medical officer's sword here, 1840 model. It's not Bontecu's sword, but Bontecu is carrying the sword in this photograph. So those are the records, and there's a brief history from the pension records of what happened to these men and what their pensions were and how they disappear in history. And then I have some Buffalo Soldier stuff here. A stamp was issued by the United States Post Office featuring the Buffalo Soldiers, and there's some first day issues. Remington, who's noted for his Western sketches, went out on several missions with the Buffalo Soldiers. So there's a collection of Remington sketches. What most people probably don't realize is the Remington Museum is in upstate New York, about almost on the Canadian border, and that's because Remington started off doing artwork of the Adirondacks, so his museum is there. So if you're ever up in upstate New York, I would suggest you see Remington's museum there. You'll see a lot of his Western stuff there too, but you'll see a lot of his earlier stuff. And there's some information here about the crater. Of those 5 men who were wounded, I think 2 of them were wounded at the Battle of the Crater. And if you have any questions about the Battle of the Crater, I'll tell you how that disaster occurred. And feel free to imbibe on the snacks over there. Thank you. And there's free newsletters up here too, if you want to take one of our newsletters. They're all different.
Thank you so enlightening.
Thank you. That's his dress uniform.
Like that, or
Yeah.
okay. No, it's just a listing of the, oh, I'm sorry. The lyrics to the song, right? I didn't have any relative who was before. My wife, great, great. Yeah.